现在订阅同盟会英语，不论找工作、升学或英检，表现更棒。快上
StudioClassroom.com。
现在请收听教学节目。
Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us now for the month of November. We have some good articles ahead, and today it's Learners for Life. We're glad to have you all with us today. I'm your teacher, Doris, and we also have
Pauline.
Pauline, thanks for coming.
So glad to be here. I always love being in the studio with you, Doris.
Well, you know, she's actually on Let's Talk, and you have to be very simple, but you can be more natural here.
That's right. I just have to be careful because when I'm natural, I talk really fast.
Well, but that's good for them to listen to. And then we have Josh today. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hi, Doris. I'm doing very well, and it's so good to be back here in the studio with both of you.
Josh is one of the editors for the Studio Classroom magazine, but we all have to have part in advance, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a good article, and it's talking about learning, and that's what we're all doing. We're learning. And what page do we start on today?
We're on page 10 today.
Okay. And it says here under the title that inmates show the world that they are more than the sum of their errors. Who are inmates anyway?
Well, that's a very good question, Doris. So inmates, we'll talk about inmates maybe in a couple of different situations. But what first comes to mind for me are for people who are in prison.
Right. We call them inmates, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and what does it mean here for the sum of their errors? That's kind of serious.
Yeah. So when we hear the word sum, that's a math word. The sum is when you add many things together. Whatever that equals is the sum. So here it's saying that people who have gone to jail are more than just all of the bad things they've ever done added together. There's more to them than just mistakes or bad things they've done.
There's more to their life. There's more to them as people than just because they did make mistakes at some time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of an interesting expression, and there's a picture here. What does it say under that picture, Pauline?
It says, Bill Corner, Calvin University Campus Security Director, helps Michael Duffner with tassel during the Calvin University Class of 2020 graduation ceremony.
Okay, so tassel is a word that we underline. What does tassel actually mean?
So tassel is any sort of like small little string or knotted string that hangs off a piece of cloth. But we use it very specifically when we talk about a style of cap that people wear for graduation, especially from high school or college.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's on one side of your hat, and then when you graduate, you put it to the other side, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Shows you've graduated.
Mm-hmm.
So,
although you will see this word in other times, like curtains might have tassels at the end.
Yeah, that's true. But usually we think about the graduation.
Yeah.
Well, as we read the article on page 10, let's take the whole first section here and start reading right now.
Learners for Life. Inmates show the world that they are more than the sum of their errors. His tassel draped correctly from his cap, and his graduation robe carefully arranged so just the top of his maroon and gold tie showed. Michael Duffler extended his fist toward Bill Corner for one last fist pump. "You look like a college graduate," Corner said. Nearly 3 decades earlier, the two men's paths had crossed. Corner, then, was with the Grand Rapids Police Department in Michigan and is now the director of campus safety at Calvin University. After a long journey, Duffler found himself standing on the stage at Calvin University's commencement ceremony, reading scripture before receiving his Bachelor of Arts degree as part of the inaugural bachelor degree class of the Calvin Prison Initiative, CPI.
So as we start to read this one, we can see that he's at this a ceremony, and it's a commencement ceremony. And whenever we talk about commencement, what do we mean?
Well, when I hear commencement ceremony, I always think of graduations.
Right. That's what it is here. And so he's graduating, but this is different because it's the Calvin Prison Initiative. Initiative is kind of a plan that they're doing, isn't it? So his tassel is draped correctly from his cap, and he's getting ready, and he's got his graduation roll, and he's just very excited about it. But he's not just a kid, is he?
No. So here it says that, well, actually it says that a little interesting kind of comment here that he had crossed paths with somebody else 3 decades earlier. So that means he's at least 30 years old. So he's no longer a kid anymore. And that he had crossed paths or he had run into or encountered someone 30 years earlier.
And instead of shaking hands, they put this fist bump nowadays, don't they? So he's ready for this one, for one last first bump. And who's corner here?
He's the Calvin University Campus Security Director.
Right. And he says, "You look like a college graduate." So what was so unusual about it? Why did you say that?
Well, the surprising thing, which we kind of know because of the deck, right? But if you had just started reading this article, the way they wrote it for you is that you feel like you're just reading the story of a regular person getting their degree in something, going to a graduation. And the very end of this section, all of a sudden, it gives us this sudden surprise that he's part of this class of the Calvin Prison Initiative. So all of a sudden it makes you suddenly go, wait a minute, is he in prison, or how is he connected to prison?
Right. 3 decades. How long is that? That's 30 years?
30 years, yeah.
The two men's paths had crossed. What does it mean when your paths cross?
Well, it just means that you encounter someone or usually you have some sort of meaningful interaction with somebody.
Right. You've met them before. Your paths, our paths have crossed before.
And we find out that when their paths crossed, Corner was actually doing a different job. He was in the Grand Rapids Police Department. So he was a police officer when he met this man, Bill Corner, who's graduating today. But now he is director of safety at this university. And somehow they've maintained contact or reconnected
They were
across
surprised
these 30
to
years.
see each other, maybe. But after this long journey, this long period of time, that's a long time, what happened to this Dother?
Yeah, so he found himself standing on a stage ready for commencement or graduation.
And after the long journey, we don't really know what that journey is yet. Again, this whole first section is kind of just trying to pique your curiosity, right? It says there's, this man, Bill Corner, met this other guy, Michael Duthler, 30 years ago. Then somehow Michael Duthler ends up connected to a prison initiative and 30 years later is graduating. And there's just lots of questions about what happened in those 30 years. And, the author's trying
this guy was a prisoner, see, right?
Well, you're kind of guessing, right? I mean, we know because of the deck. So I feel like the author's really doing a lot to try and make you want to know what happened. What's his connection to prison? What happened in those 30 years between meeting as a police officer and now the guy in the university?
When you think about the inmates, you don't think about them reading scripture, reading the Bible. Reading the Bible before receiving his bachelor's degree. This is all part of this ceremony. And inaugural, what does inaugural actually mean?
So inaugural just means the first of a planned series of things to happen.
Right. From the Calvin Prison Program or Initiative. So this is kind of different, isn't it? We can see this is not your regular thing. And if you've got the picture here, you can see he's not just a young man.
Right.
Reading from college. So this just makes us interested to find out more. So let's find out what happened on the way to this graduation, because it took a long time. The next section says the path to graduation. Let's read down through line 15.
The path to graduation. In the early 1990s, Dufler was involved in what he calls a small gang, although there was no formal structure to it like other gangs. He was involved in the murder of one of the members of the gang and was arrested. On November 5, 1992, after he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and a felony firearms charge, he was sentenced to life with a possibility of parole. Over the next couple of decades, Dufler moved around the Michigan prison system, like most prisoners do. He learned various vocational trades, worked as a clerk, learned to interpret for deaf inmates, and taught himself Spanish so he could help inmates who didn't read English.
Now we find out more about him, and it's not so simple.
No, it really is a long journey, isn't it? Right? So here we start off in the early 1990s, and that he was involved, and it doesn't say how old he was at the time, but he was probably a younger man, or
Maybe teenager, who
maybe
knows?
a teenager, right? That he was involved in what he calls a small gang. So
Right.
something that wasn't really organized, like some of the big organized gangs that they have in some parts of the world. But it looks like he got himself in some trouble.
Right. It was a small gang. It didn't have a lot of structure to it. It wasn't the mafia or some big deal.
Yeah, right. But there was some really serious violence that happened in that gang. And
What happened?
One of the members of the gang was murdered.
Right.
And this man,
So they arrested the other people.
Michael,
right?
was involved. Yep, so he was arrested.
1992. Well, once you're arrested, then you have a choice of different things, and they sometimes give people a plea deal. What is a plea deal?
So a plea deal means that instead of going through the court system, instead of going through the full process of trying to prove whether or not you're guilty or innocent, you go ahead and plea guilty. So you say that, yes, I did it, and then they offer you a deal
If you tell them.
if you tell them that you're guilty, they offer you a deal that gives you maybe a little bit of a lesser prison sentence, so not quite as bad as if you had gone through the court and have a judge give it to you.
So people like to make these deals because then they get off a little bit easier in some ways. But he had to plead guilty to being part of that. We don't know what part he had in it, but it was a second-degree murder. Now, what's the difference in a first-degree murder and a second-degree murder?
I think that, again, we're talking about your involvement in a murder as
He didn't
opposed
actually
to
do it himself, but he was in it.
something like that. It's not as direct, and it's definitely not premeditated. So
No.
if you planned on going and killing a person, that would be first degree, from my understanding.
Yeah, so there's the way that the legal system in the United States sort of defines different degrees of how serious a crime is when it comes to murder. The difference, I believe, between first and second, there are a couple of different definitions there, but I think one of the biggest ones is, like Pauline had said, is that it doesn't show that you had really planned it out
something
ahead of
happened.
time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Something happened.
Well, and then not only the murder part, but they had firearms, felony firearms. Now, firearms has to do with guns and everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, so here, if you have a firearms charge, it just means that you were charged with maybe the illegal possession, or you have a weapon or a firearm or a gun or a rifle of something that you're not supposed to have according to law.
And a felony is a type of criminal record that you get. We have felonies and misdemeanors in the United States. So you might get a misdemeanor for maybe you spray paint a wall with your name on it and you weren't supposed to. It's not your wall. So you might get
That's still felony.
That would probably be a misdemeanor. But a felony is going to be your violent crimes and bigger.
Yeah, so the American justice system is a little bit interesting because they have states that have their own laws, and then they have the federal government that has their own laws. And sometimes when you commit a crime, it could be against state law, it could be against a federal law, both at the same time. But the more serious crimes tend to be what they call felonies.
Well, this certainly sounds very serious because when you're sentenced to life, wow. But when you sentence to life, there's two ways. One of them is maybe you can get paroled later and you have a possibility. Other times they say no possibility of parole.
Right.
There's no way you're ever going to get out. What is parole?
So parole means that you're allowed to leave the prison system early, because you have shown that you can behave in a way that's safe and normal. And then while you're out of prison, they monitor you and they kind of connect with you to make sure that you don't do anything that would justify you having to go back to prison again. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so the possibility of parole doesn't mean he is guaranteed. He doesn't have the promise that he'll get out of jail. He might still be in jail for the rest of his life, but at least he has the hope that maybe if he works really hard and does well, there's a hope that he could get
So
back
that's
out.
pretty serious.
But
Very
it is very
serious.
serious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to be, second-degree murder, sentenced for life.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And he was probably very young at the time, don't you think?
You would
He was
guess
probably,
so, yeah.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for the next couple of decades, which is 10, 20 years, he moved around in the prison system like most prisoners do. They have different things, different jobs, different places, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes prisoners will be transferred from different prison to different prisons within a state, and then they might move around in different areas within a prison. So I think that's what they're talking about here.
Well, and they also try to have them do something, not just sit in prison.
Mm-hmm.
What did he learn to do?
Well, this is good because that's not always true in all prisons. We could definitely use more of this. But thankfully, he had the opportunity to learn some various vocational trades, vocational skills that you can use for jobs. Vocation is a career or a job.
Right. He worked as a clerk sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And what else did he do?
Now, this is very interesting. So he learned to interpret for deaf inmates and taught himself Spanish so he could help inmates who didn't read English.
So he was trying to learn something. He wasn't just going to sit there in prison.
Exactly.
It looks to me like he's eager to learn, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. So vocational trades are more like, physical skills, like maybe carpentry or, and then he also then learned skills with languages as well. So he was really applying himself in order to learn a lot.
I mean, that's amazing. Learning how to interpret for deaf inmates, I mean, that's a big undertaking.
It is. And learn another language and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't read English, they're Spanish, and he tried to help them. So, for people doing that type of thing, they're more apt to get parole, aren't they?
You hope so. That's not always true, but we hope so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's take the last paragraph of today's lesson that starts in line 16, second column on page 10.
He also took every possible unaccredited, non-credit class offered in whatever prison he was in, whether it was a poetry class or a literature class. Then in 2014, he almost had a chance to go home on parole. At the time, he was thinking about going into something in the building trades when he was released. Because of a disability, he walks with a cane now. He was thinking of working in Finnish carpentry and then heading into religious ministry, but he didn't get out. Then he heard about the CPI.
So he did keep trying. He took these classes, and sometimes you didn't get any credit for it. You expect to graduate from something, you have to get credit. But he just took the class because he was interested. It's interesting. He even took poetry and things, didn't he?
Yeah, I love that. Obviously, somebody who really had an enthusiasm for learning.
Right. And we don't know why he has this disability. Something happened. Mm-hmm. But he walks with a cane. And he was trying to think of what to do. He was thinking of this carpentry job. But then heading into religious ministry. So probably at the prison they also had some teaching about the Bible and things, don't you think?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's there are a number of what they call prison ministries, where they go specifically to prison in order to help inmates sort of struggle with what they've done in the past and to look for ways in order to be able to find a little bit of forgiveness and help them by showing them the Bible and having them read Scripture.
So, but he didn't get out. So He was probably a little disappointed.
Yeah, I think that'd be incredibly discouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually for the parole system, it's a very, very long, complicated process to be
Yes.
able to apply for parole, is what they call it. And then you go in front of a group of people called a parole board. And at the parole board, sometimes what will happen is victims of the crime that you committed, even if it was 20, 30 years ago, are allowed to come and speak in order to convince the parole board one way or another whether it's appropriate for someone to be released on parole. But it sounds like it's very difficult for anyone who's been in the prison system, even if they're sentenced to a certain amount of time before they can get parole or possibility of parole.
Right.
It's very, very
It's not
difficult.
easy.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah, yeah. My family has personal friends who have gone through that. It is extremely difficult. As we were saying, and like somebody who does all these amazing things should be able to get parole. You would sure hope, but you can only say that you would hope because there's no
Right.
guarantee. It is a very difficult thing to get parole.
And when they're on the parole, they have to be very careful because they're being watched all the time. And if they do one wrong thing, they're back in
Yeah,
prison.
the smallest little things. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
things just like getting a speeding ticket or
Yeah,
things
right.
that we wouldn't
Don't
think
break
of
the
as
law, right.
yeah, but things that we wouldn't think of as really dangerous or bad, just making mistakes. So yeah, it's not an easy path to get out of it once you've gotten into the prison system.
But then he heard about this new plan, and it's called the Calvin Prison Initiative. And why is it called Calvin?
That is a very good question, and I think we're going to learn a little bit more about that. But I'm going to guess that it has something to do with Calvin University.
Right. So we're going to find out more about that tomorrow. We've got one more day to talk about him. But he heard about that. And then he thought, okay, I didn't get out, but here's something I can do. So he started to do this new plan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you have this moment that feels really bleak for him. Bleak just means really dire or hopeless, right? He had all this hope built up that he's going to be able to get out in 2014. He had a plan for the kind of job he would do and going into ministry, and then all of that fell through. He wasn't able to get out.
And some people might just give up.
And you could understand if he did, but thankfully an opportunity came up and he found the hope again to try for something new.
So there's a lot of words about prisons here and about plea deals and second degree, and so we can know what these are when we read about them.
Yeah, or if you like to watch dramas on TV, there's lots of detective shows on TV or courtroom dramas. You'd hear a lot of these kind of words on those TV shows.
That's right. So it's kind of a vocabulary that you don't usually talk about. But we're going to find out a little bit more about this Calvin Prison Initiative. It sounds like something different, and you have to come back tomorrow to find out more about that. But what are some of the things we need to remember from today?
Well, I think today there's a couple of things we need to remember. We need to remember that we've been introduced to this man who, as a young boy, we think, did something very serious.
Belonged to a gang.
Belonged to a gang, was involved in a murder, and that he spent decades of his life really trying to improve himself, spent a lot of time learning, spent a lot of time taking whatever classes he could take, although they were unaccredited classes, so they weren't classes that would count towards a degree or a graduation.
Right.
And then in 2014, so that was 22 years later after he was admitted to the prison system, he was eligible for a parole. And even though he had done all of these things in order to
Improve right?
himself, to educate himself, the parole board still decided that he shouldn't be allowed to leave prison, so he had to stay. And we're sort of then left at, well, he thought he had an idea of what he could do, but he wasn't really sure. He did have some sort of disability, meaning that physically he wasn't capable of just doing any kind of job. And then we have this moment where he hears of the Calvin Prison Initiative.
And then he had a ray of hope. He heard about this new plan called the Calvin Prison Initiative. And he didn't give up and just say, well, I guess I'll never get out. He didn't do that.
Doesn't seem like it, because we do know they did give us a little, flash forward at the beginning of the article, and we know that there's this moment where he is, moving his tassel on his graduation cap. So we know something good's going to happen. We know somehow he ends up graduating with a degree, and that's connected to the Calvin Prison Initiative. We just haven't gotten all the pieces yet for how that came to be, and that's what we get to learn about tomorrow.
Well, and if you have the magazine and you can see the picture, he's not a young man anymore.
That's right. So it was a long time coming, we say in English.
You know, if you've been in prison 30 years, it's probably quite different to get out and live you haven't lived in the world for a long time. A lot of adjustments to make.
That's for sure, yeah. And we don't actually really even know if he's out of prison or not yet. We just know that he's
graduating.
He's somehow graduated with a degree in something. So lots of questions still.
Well, we're going to have to come back tomorrow and find out more about this. So be sure and be with us. And let us know if there's anything that you want to let us, what kind of programs you'd like to hear, what subjects you like. Write us a letter sometimes, an email, right? And be sure and check our websites.
Yes.
And we'll see you back here tomorrow. We talk more about this program of Calvin University. So we'll say goodbye for now.
Goodbye.